G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and this is my best Professor Fit. Now today what we're going to be doing, and this is going to be fairly wordy, but we're going to be looking at the situation of what we have on the ground and the several different stages of warfare that we've gone through to get to the position that we see now and the position of what we are at and the successes and failures in each of those stages. And then we will talk about what the next stages are before we get to some agreement or some victory on the front line as what we see now. Now, everything, of course, is subject to change, and we could see a peace agreement tomorrow as likely as we may see a huge escalation. Everything in war is unknown. We cannot predict the future, and the past doesn't represent exactly what the future will say. But there's been promises and failures, and these have led to changing limits and strategies, and then the escalation of what we now have on the ground. And this is what I see after that will be then the next steps of warfare, because the goal hasn't changed. The goal of victory was set day one and still maintains for Ukraine's 1991 borders, including areas that have been occupied now for over 10 years. And the West has made the promise to Ukraine for support as long as this then goal takes. And it doesn't seem that Ukraine is willing to budge on that at all. And Ukraine is saying we're leaving it in Ukraine's hands. Sorry, the West is saying we're leaving it in Ukraine's hands to make up what they see fit. And that is then the victory. And like we spoke about, where that would lie. Now, this commitment does mean that when a plan has been raised of either weapons or equipment or whatever, and it has failed, well, then restrictions on equipment or whatever being sent in that was initially set have had to move, because if that didn't change and the plan had failed, well, you're just going to repeat the same mistakes. The question a lot of people that are asking is, well, how far will we have to move those restrictions, and to what degree is the West willing to go for the victory of the goal and the plan that Ukraine has set forth of those borders? So let's go over the several stages of what we have seen so far. So the first stage, stage one, was to halt the Russian initial advancement on the 24th of February 2022. Now, judging comments from before and after, that both NATO and Russian leaders were both equally surprised at how well Ukraine was actually able, with ground tactics, selfless acts by soldiers and civilians, and political decisions, able in 2022 to defend cities and essentially halt the Russian war effort. This stage for the power difference between Russia and Ukraine was a huge success and did limit, in the large losses Russia took, their actions of maneuver warfare following on from this for a large amount of time, over 12 months. Now, stage two is delivering basic weapon systems. Now, these stages, there's a lot of overlap in this, but was delivering these basic systems, these mobility systems, these vehicles, these APCs, these armour, and then a variety of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities to Ukraine. And when I say capabilities, it's not just giving Ukraine radios and cameras. It's not just giving Ukraine the systems to do it. It's supplying Ukraine from outside, from aircraft flying in the Black Sea, from aircraft over NATO, from satellites flying overhead, supplying them then in that intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance findings. And this was not only in the effort to halt the advancement, but in late 2022, taking advantage of the higher losses Russia had taken and the disconnect of units on the front lines, and having the largest advancements we've seen by Ukraine across Kharkiv and Kherson. Now, it was at this stage that many have said was the high water line for Ukraine, when the least amount of territory had been occupied. And since then that is actually now true. As since this point, we have not seen any net gain of land for Ukraine or overall frontline successes. Now, others will say that this was the chance. This was the chance for getting Russia on their heels and pushing through. And by letting that up and not having the equipment or the manpower at the time to do it, it allowed Russia well over 12 months to build defensive works that have so far proven to be somewhat impenetrable if we take the 2023 then offensive. Now, many of these initial systems that got put in at stage 2 had a lot of success early, such as the Bayraktar drone. But due to counters, these have not been seen on the battlefield now for a long time. It shows that the weapon systems delivered do have a short life of when that they are effective on the front lines. Stage 3, and this is all mixed in the same time frame as number 1 and 2 and continuing, is limiting Russian industrial capacity through massive sanctions and some secret genie in a bottle who attacked a pipeline. But although it was widely known these sanctions wouldn't take immediate effect, but it was expected that over the next month, maybe the next year, it would greatly limit Russia's capacity and that Ukraine would have military victories on the front line, not only from the power of the Ukrainian military itself, but from the lack of Russian power. And I think this was initially the West's goal, was how can we give Ukraine enough to defeat Russia? We can't do that, but if we chop the legs off Russia, then the amount we've given can do that. I think a victory was reliant on a defeat from Russia, if that makes sense. But so far, we're more than 2 years on, and it has had some effect, but nowhere near the effect on Russia that was initially expected. And Russia has built trade networks in other nations. I mean, today we have UAE saying that the sanctions haven't worked, and we see Russia building a $500 million nuclear power plant in Uzbekistan, as well as a heap of other control into Asia and Africa. And this has sped up the rise of the East and South and Russia and China's further influence over countries in this area, and then in turn decreasing Western influence in then these areas. Now, stage 4 is what I call the realization and acceptance. The realization and acceptance that Ukraine could not take back territory without heavy and modern equipment. And this is when we saw the policy shift and countries deliver not only the training, but tanks and IFVs, more modern systems than the Soviet systems that Ukraine was using. And these were given and promised to, quote, smash through the defensive works of which Russia had been building after their heavy losses in 2022. That Wagner PMC in early 23 gave the Russian forces an opportunity to take up the fight by Wagner for the forces to reconstitute, rebuild themselves, and then build those lines. Suffering, of course, large losses themselves, but gave the regular forces then that time. Stage 5, counteroffensive. Now, this was long awaited, overhyped, and ultimately not only a failure, but to many, including myself, will say it had a net negative effect due to the high losses in this offensive, despite warnings from NATO military experts saying not to launch this. Now, it showed without more troops and supporting elements that these attacks, these offensives would not be successful. And I believe that this was pushed and rushed through in an effort to show some success on what was being defended as the front line is not stagnant. We are not in an attritional war. Now, the over-exaggerated capability of these Western tanks compared to the Soviet-era vehicles Ukraine had been using and that Russia is using has not shown any significant difference on the front lines. It doesn't mean that a T-72 is better or worse than an Abrams. We know an Abrams is a significantly better tank, but if they can't get into the fight and they're being used as artillery pieces, but you've got so many more of these and you're willing to lose them, X over here, of which you don't have that many and you're not willing to lose them, the effect on the front line is very different. The effect of the counteroffensive failing likely delayed another major push, probably 2 years. It is very unlikely that we will see a push this year. And this has given Russia the opportunity of which we now see. They built up massive defensive works, and defensive works are still being built. They had massive soldier buildup in the hundreds of thousands, and now an acknowledgement of the reconstitution of its forces, with some American officials saying it's more powerful than the beginning of the war. And this also gave Russia then the opportunity of which we see now of them then having the initiative on the front line to capitalize on Ukraine's lack of weapons and lack of manpower. Now, the lack of ammunition can be artificial from the lack of support from Western countries in, but as well with the manpower and with then the munitions being down too, could come down to the non-acceptance, of not accepting that it is an attritional war, that you may need to trade time for ground, moving rearwards, and not trying to plug every hole as something opens up and pushing in manpower and weapons into there to not have a PR loss, not have the optics of losing ground. Needs to step away from the optics and look at that this is long-term attritional warfare. Now, stage 6 is long-range strike capability and fighter aircraft. Now, NATO, again, had to move its own goalposts to allow these long-range strike capabilities to Ukraine. Firstly, in the form of Storm Shadow Scalp, and more recently then the ATACMS. Now, the fighter aircraft, these are yet to arrive, and we don't know how much influence they will have. Some are saying they are arriving too late. But this was a huge step in the West to allow and supply these. But these were supplied because of the failures of the steps prior. If that didn't fail, the West wouldn't have stepped over the line that it had drawn. But this also shows with the fighter jets the time frame of what the West was willing to back Ukraine's effort, knowing that it was going to be well over a year of that training and now it's coming to an end. So in the foreseeable future, though, the only major weapons change from the 2023 offensive is the F-16, and not in that many great numbers. Ukraine still say that they will need more. Any training on other advanced systems will be possibly now late for a 2025 offensive. If you want X type of jet or X type of helicopter, even if the training started today, would it be ready by then? Now, stage 7 is where we are now. And given that many of these other stages have failed to show much result actually on the front line, we are now crossing another line that we drew in the sand of using Western weapons inside of Russia. Now, I believe the West didn't want to do this, but it's because of these failures of why they've had to do that, along with we've committed to supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. But if this step, well, fuck, we have to take the next step of this. Now with many countries forming a coalition of nations for their systems to be used inside Russia. Basically all but the US and Germany as far as major players in this. Now from here, we'll talk about the next steps that I see, and this is discounting a lot of left and right of where this could go. It discounts that there's a negotiated settlement, and it discounts in that of land concessions. And also, we don't know what will happen with the American presidential vote and an administrative change. We have no idea. But stage 8, which is what we're seeing somewhat now but not fully announced, is massive conscription of Ukrainian men to stabilise the front line, to form a body for a 2025 offensive, training in the West, training in Ukraine. The sheer amount of manpower needed to even think about taking areas like Donetsk and Crimea will be absolutely massive. We haven't seen any offensive in any areas that built up, whether Russian or Ukrainian. And stage 9 follows this. The realization, whether they like it or not, of that this is attritional warfare with drones, with jets, with choppers, with all these other systems, maneuver warfare much behind the line is not going to work. It's going to get cut off. It's going to get taken out. And that any movement from here in an attritional war between two powers will have huge, huge losses of men and machines. And that ties into Crimea and Donetsk and what is the limit. How far is Ukraine willing to push to take those areas? I know they've set that as their victory and the only way to this, but there needs to be a realization in an attritional war, it's going to be large. If Ukraine is saying that what Russia has taken is so far 500,000 men, well, you can think about moving back the other way against much, much more heavily defended areas and experience that both countries now have. Stage 10, I see, is the deployment of forces in the rear to ease pressure on Ukrainian third-line logistical elements. Now, when I say this is stage 8, 9, 10 is sort of all together, but I think stage 10 is what we're seeing. We're going to see this conscription. We know how many men are going to be needed. And number 10, the deployment of Western forces to try and ease pressure behind the line. Seeing, firstly, will be feeling out, seeing the public reaction. How do they see this deployment? And especially listening, the government's listening, when a uniformed Western soldier is killed somewhere behind the line, what is then the reaction to this? Is it positive for let's send more? Is it negative? What the fuck are we then doing there? And of course, this may lead into decisions made for second line, front line troops down the line. And stage 11, which I think is the one that scares me the most and I think about the most, is forced escalation. We've seen this year particularly, the messaging about Russia has changed from it being some blundering backwater military to one that now could threaten NATO and will push through, and people could go to Berlin. And this messaging signals the threat is now beyond Ukraine and that Europeans and the world order is at threat from a power struggling to get 20%. Now, critical thinkers will say, even if you look at it in the bubble of the most pro-Ukrainian or most pro-Russian element, that this doesn't stand up to critique of that Russia is a threat here. One, if you're on the most pro-Russian side, I'd say Putin or any of the officials have never shown any interest in doing that. And if you're on the most pro-Ukrainian side, you'd say, well, we can defeat them with our military and some weapons given in. It would show on that thinking, well, there's no way then they're going to have a realistic threat against NATO. But in this, I do believe it is in the interest of military objectives. I'm not meaning in the interest of us, but in the military objective goals interest on the ground to have an escalation of forces and then the involvement of NATO troops. Now, whether this is achieved through public support of Ukrainian goals and countries in Europe and America and Australia go, yep, we want to send our boys, or through some sort of false flag event that triggers then the deployment of these forces in, or a Russian escalation, that Russia do something that the West cannot ignore and then have to deploy in. I think you can see I will take the second as most likely, third as then the second most likely, and the first one there as least likely. Now, stage 12, there'll have to be a decision on Western combat troops or negotiation. That will come if we see an escalatory event and or the public opinion beyond can we achieve these goals. Now, I'm not willing to say if an escalation takes place that the West will have the response of then deploying troops onto the ground. And a lot of that would depend on the administration that is sitting in the White House at the time. Yes, Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania may say this, but there's no way that Western combat troops are going to be deployed out of NATO without Germany and US backing, especially that those smaller European countries have sent a large amount of their existing capability already to Ukraine. If it's not if NATO's deploying not backed by the UK, Germany, and especially the US, well, I guess we will see, but it wouldn't be happening. But a lot of this sits with possibly who is sitting in the hot seat in the White House. So, legends, that's just my take over the stages of what we've seen, the successes and failures, and why then lines we've drawn in the sand have had to be crossed, and then the next stages of which I see this war going. Now, if you've got to this point in the video, these are my more breakdowny videos of just things I want to speak about, things that I sit up in bed all night thinking about. But let me know. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.